I didn't think such a situation would ever happen to me, or that I would find myself in such a position, but it all started when Harris's car pulled up to our house. I stood by the window, barely containing a strange sense of anticipation that surged with each passing moment. Harris was not just a stepfather. He had always been something more than just a part of my life. He was someone I could turn to at any time, knowing he would listen, never judge, and that I could be myself around him, free of masks and defenses. In my teenage years, he had seemed like a hero from a movie, but as I grew older, it was as though we had learned to communicate in another language, without hints, words, or gestures, as if understanding each other on an intuitive level. When Harris finally got out of the car, he spread his arms for a greeting, and I couldn't resist. I went up to him and hugged him a little longer than necessary. It was a natural movement, but somehow it made my heart beat faster. "Good to see you, Maddie," he said, his voice warmer than usual. He smelled of wood balm, a light scent he always used. I held my breath for a moment, thinking that our joint work had begun, something I had agreed to without a second thought. My husband, Jake, approached with a smile and shook Harris's hand warmly. My relationship with Jake was smooth and calm. He cared for me and always found the right words in difficult moments. But lately, maybe because of that same stability, I'd started wondering what I was missing. Everything was fine. We could discuss any topic without arguments or outbursts, but every evening ended with the same monotonous ritual. I tried to brush these thoughts aside, convincing myself that there was no need to seek more in something already well established. That day, Harris didn't come alone. He was accompanied by his friend, Frank. When I first saw him, I felt a slight unease. Tall, solidly built, with a piercing gaze and a confident smile. Frank seemed like someone you'd want to keep your distance from, and at the same time, someone whose opinion you'd like to know. He looked at me a little longer than politeness typically allowed, which made me feel uneasy. But Harris seemed not to notice this. He and Jake talked, exchanging jokes, and at some point, I noticed Jake seemed slightly out of place around these two men. After some light conversation, we all headed to the backyard, where Harris and Frank were supposed to help Jake with repairs and landscaping. The weather was warm, and I couldn't help but think about how strange it was. Suddenly, being around them made me feel that something was changing within me. Thin threads of anxiety and anticipation began to intertwine. I felt this visit for Harris was more than just friendly help, or maybe I was simply trying to find a reason for my vague feelings. That evening, we sat on the porch talking about life. Jake shared childhood stories, laughing when Harris recalled how he first met his parents at a city festival. A sense of comfort and security filled the air, yet for some reason I couldn't shake off a light sense of tension. Frank gave me strange looks, while Harris behaved as though we were old friends who hadn't seen each other in a long time. His presence made my heart beat faster, and I suddenly realized how much I missed that feeling, when someone could evoke not just affection, but something more. When we said goodbye, Harris gently took my hand. His fingers squeezed my palm slightly longer than necessary, and that brief moment seemed to light something inside me. I forced myself to look away, hoping no one noticed how that touch had thrown me off balance. When Jake went inside, I was left alone with Harris and Frank, who, with a smirk, suddenly said, "Well, Maddie, you didn't think any of us would actually come here to help with the repairs, did you?" His voice had an undertone, and shrugging, I tried to respond as naturally as possible. "Honestly, no. I thought you'd both be busy with your own lives." Harris looked at me with a slight smile on his face. "I'm always ready to help. You know that." With those words, he lightly touched my shoulder, and again, I felt that strange sensation that had been bothering me from the beginning. That night, I couldn't sleep. Thoughts revolved around how the atmosphere in the house had changed with Harris and Frank's arrival. I was disturbed by the strange blend of trust and slight anxiety their presence evoked. I didn't think I would ever notice his gaze lingering a bit longer than usual. Harris was an attentive person, but his attention today carried a different shade, as though something more lay hidden behind his familiar kindness. The day with Jake was pleasant. We worked together in the yard, exchanged jokes, and reminisced about funny moments from our shared life. At times like these, I felt that everything was stable and calm between us, though deep inside there was a vague sense of dissatisfaction, an unclear emptiness I couldn't quite explain. Everything was fine, and yet something seemed missing, as if I were living in a meticulously designed box devoid of emotions. In the evening, when Jake went to bed, I went downstairs and found Harris in the kitchen with a book. He smiled and gestured for me to sit next to him. It seemed there was nothing unusual about it, so I sat down, trying to regain my inner calm. He asked if I'd like a glass of wine, and as the wine's rich taste warmed me, I gradually relaxed, allowing myself to fully immerse in the conversation. We talked about life, the past, reminiscing about stories we shared from my childhood. His words transported me back to a time when he had been my rock, and I was young and uncertain. But at some point, the conversation took a deeper turn, and he asked, "What do you think? Why do people stay together?" I tensed, trying to find the right words. "I think at some point they just get used to each other and are afraid of change," I replied, avoiding direct eye contact. His question was too personal, as if he was asking with some hidden intention. Harris looked at me closely, raising an eyebrow slightly. "Funny, but it seems to me that true relationships are based not on habit, but on a deep, almost elusive understanding of each other," he said, and his voice had a note of something tender, almost sensual. I felt a strange anxiety. The boundary between us seemed to be dissolving, and his words left a deep impression. We exchanged a long look, and I felt he saw something more in me than just a familiar and dear person. I took a sip of wine, trying to shake off the strange feeling. But each time I looked at Harris, I saw not only a stepfather, but a man whose presence began to fill the emptiness I couldn't explain to myself. By evening, I felt waves of fatigue rolling over me. The work in the yard with Jake seemed endless. When I returned to the house, Harris was waiting for me in the kitchen, and he immediately noticed my state. "You look exhausted, Maddie," he said with a warm smile. I nodded, feeling drained. "Would you like me to give you a massage?" Harris offered so casually that I agreed without a second thought. Sitting down on a chair, I relaxed my shoulders a bit and closed my eyes. His hands settled on my shoulders, soft and careful. At first I was simply grateful, feeling the day's tension melt away. But after a few seconds, I realized his touch held something more than just care. His fingers moved confidently and smoothly, gently touching my neck and shoulders. I tried to focus only on the comfort, but something inside me was already alert. His touch felt too warm, too prolonged. I felt strange, but couldn't make myself stand up and end the massage. "You're really very tense," Harris said softly, his voice sounding close, making me shiver as if waking from a light slumber. The massage was so simple, yet it left an invisible imprint on my skin, a feeling that was hard to erase from memory. When he finished, I tried to thank him, but my voice came out softer than I expected. He nodded, still smiling warmly, but I could no longer ignore the look in his eyes, warm and attentive, yet hiding something more. I quickly got up, trying to be alone with my thoughts and understand my feelings. All of this was just due to fatigue, I told myself. It was just a massage, nothing more. But why then did the feeling linger in my mind, as though something between us had already changed? Days passed, but thoughts of Harris stubbornly returned. Sometimes I caught myself recalling his touch, warm, confident, with a slightly deeper meaning than ordinary care. It unsettled me, yet the more I tried to brush these thoughts aside, the stronger they became. Every day, Harris and I crossed paths, and with each new conversation, I realized more clearly that his attention and support had become something special for me. His kindness was tangible, almost palpable, and at times I noticed that every look, every gesture of his was starting to take on a significance it shouldn't have. One evening, when Jake went to bed earlier than usual, I went down to the kitchen and saw Harris, thoughtfully sitting at the table. He noticed me and smiled, inviting me to sit. The time when Jake would fall asleep and I would come down to find Harris, who seemed to be waiting for me, had become something I anticipated. We talked about many things, work, plans for the house, but at some point the conversation seemed to shift, taking on a subtle tension, barely perceptible but present. Harris spoke of family values, of the importance of supporting each other, and I suddenly realized his words weren't simply friendly concern. These were the reflections of someone genuinely interested in my thoughts and feelings. "Sometimes support is all we have," he said softly, looking into my eyes with a warmth that spread a strange, almost painful feeling inside me. The evening had been long and exhausting, and I felt as if my body was weighed down with lead. The ache in my shoulders and neck tugged, reminding me of every tense moment of the day. I remembered how Harris's last massage had brought me relief, and, as if without thinking, I decided to ask him for it again. When I found Harris, he immediately noticed my condition. "You seem completely worn out," he said sympathetically, giving a gentle smile. His smile, for some reason, filled me with a sense of peace, and I nodded in agreement. Yes, it was indeed a tough day. "Could you help me again?" Without hesitation, Harris nodded. "Of course. This time I'll bring some oil. It'll help you relax even more." His words caused a slight embarrassment, but I found no reason to refuse. After all, his touch really did ease the tension. I sat down trying to calm myself and ignore the inner excitement. As Harris started the massage, I felt the warm oil slowly heating my skin, and his hands, smooth and sure, kneaded each knot of tension. He was gentle and tender, as if he knew exactly what I needed. I closed my eyes, feeling his fingers slowly slide over my neck and shoulders, letting myself sink into the sensations, momentarily forgetting everything around me. Gradually, his hands moved down to my shoulders, and I found myself almost anticipating his touch. A barely perceptible shiver ran through me, and I felt my breathing slow, becoming shallow. There was something incredibly intimate about this moment, something I hadn't expected at all. Suddenly, his fingers lingered a bit longer, and without thinking, I turned my head. For a moment, silence hung between us, filled with a sense of anticipation, and before I could understand what was happening, our faces were only a breath apart. His gaze met mine, and in that instant, we both knew that the boundary we had tried not to cross had already been erased. Harris leaned in slowly, his lips gently brushing against mine, as if testing whether he had understood my feelings correctly. The kiss was soft, barely noticeable, but within it was something that turned everything inside me upside down. It was unexpected and frightening, but I couldn't pull away, as if my body had decided for me without asking for permission. We both pulled back, saying nothing, caught in a moment of confusion. The next morning I woke with a crushing sense of guilt, as if everything that had happened the night before wasn't a dream, but something deeply wrong. The images of our kiss haunted me, and with each passing moment I felt the anxiety build. I tried to push these thoughts aside, convincing myself it was just a moment of weakness, a whim that meant nothing. But the guilt only grew stronger with every attempt to forget. I avoided being alone with Harris, trying to keep my distance. Every time our eyes met, a wave of shame and fear washed over me. What if he told Jake? What if everyone found out? These questions left me restless. With Jake, too, I felt a growing tension, slowly building between us. He was still kind to me, but a certain coldness had crept into his behavior, as if he sensed something was off. We spoke less and less, and I noticed how silence filled our shared space. Each attempt to start a conversation ended with me averting my gaze, unable to hide my emotions. I was afraid to admit my thoughts to him, knowing that even the simplest words could destroy everything we had built together. But along with this fear grew a lack of understanding of who I had become, a woman caught in her own contradictions, or someone ready to do something irrevocable. Harris also remained silent. He avoided mentioning what had happened, and this silence, instead of easing my mind, only intensified the tension. Frank returned a few days later, just when I began to hope that the unsettling tension between Harris and me might start to subside. He came back to help with the yard work as before, but this time his presence seemed somehow less innocent. It was as if something in his gaze suggested that he knew more than he should. Each time I caught him looking at me, it felt as though he was studying me intently. It was more than mere curiosity. It was a kind of interest tinged with a hidden understanding, as if he were trying to piece together what was happening between Harris and me. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that he was simply an observant person. But an inner voice insisted there was something deeper behind his calm smile. One evening, I noticed Frank and Harris standing off in the distance at the edge of the yard, engrossed in conversation. Frank whispered something quietly, leaning closer to Harris, who looked momentarily uneasy before settling back into his usual calm expression. They glanced in my direction, and I quickly looked away, pretending to be focused on my own tasks, but my heart was pounding. When Frank came into the house, I felt his eyes on me. He smiled, but his smile wasn't the usual friendly one. It held a faint hint of mockery. It was as if he were trying to say something without words, without revealing his true intentions. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself these were just my own imaginings, but every glance from him seemed to confirm that he already understood everything. I struggled to understand exactly what Harris had awakened in me, why his presence made my heart race and beat harder like I was 20 again. It was a strange feeling, both frightening and thrilling. He was the person I'd always turned to for advice, someone I'd always considered family, and now he was becoming something more. In his gaze, in every word there was care, but behind that simple concern lay an elusive, deeper subtext. I wanted to tell myself it was all temporary, just a passing attraction that would disappear if I simply ignored it. "It's just a mild interest," I kept repeating, trying to reduce it to mere curiosity. But every time we were alone, that strange tension returned, and my thoughts drifted back to that brief, forbidden kiss, to his gaze filled with warmth and understanding, his face, his voice, his touch. All of it had become a source from which I couldn't walk away, no matter how hard I tried. I continued to interact with Harris, trying to act normally, but each time I felt an invisible line between us, barely noticeable yet present. Neither of us mentioned that kiss, but it remained rooted in my memory, impossible to erase. Sometimes it felt as though all I had to do was reach out, and that invisible barrier would vanish. That day, I happened to be alone with Frank. Jake had gone out for errands, Harris was in the yard, and I was sitting on the porch savoring a rare moment of calm. But as soon as Frank came over and sat down beside me, the peace instantly evaporated. He looked at me intently with a barely noticeable smirk, as though he knew more than he was letting on. "Maddie," he began, so casually as if he were talking about everyday things. "Something tells me that there's something special between you and Harris. Am I wrong?" His words took my breath away. I tried to keep a calm expression, but inside everything clenched. My thoughts raced, and I had no idea how to respond. "You don't understand." I tried to brush off the conversation, but Frank leaned in closer, and there was something both unsettling and oddly compelling in his gaze. "You know, sometimes another person reminds us of who we really are. We all need that reminder now and then." His voice was warm, almost understanding. I felt a strange mixture of embarrassment and irritation, but even more, an uneasiness that he could see what I had been trying so hard to hide. Frank smiled and, as if offhandedly, suggested, "Maybe we could meet for coffee sometime. Sometimes talking to a neutral person helps sort things out." I knew right away I didn't want to go for coffee with him. "Thanks, Frank, but that's not necessary," I replied, trying to keep my tone calm, though my voice wavered slightly. His smile remained, but a flicker of disappointment crossed his eyes. I turned back to my book, trying to brush off the awkwardness and lingering discomfort left by that conversation. I could no longer deny it. In the quiet moments alone with myself, thoughts of Harris filled my mind entirely. Memories of his touch, that brief moment of closeness we'd shared, made my heart beat faster. I realized that I no longer wanted to avoid these feelings. I was tired of trying to deceive myself. In the evening, after Jake went to bed, I made up my mind and found Harris in the living room. He was sitting with a book, and when he noticed me, he smiled. I felt a surge of excitement building up inside me, but I tried to stay calm. "Harris," I began softly, stepping closer, and for a moment his gaze lingered on me as if he too felt the tension between us. The suggestion caught me off guard, but I agreed, feeling a strange thrill at the thought. When Harris placed the blindfold over my eyes, the world around me faded, leaving only darkness and my own thoughts. I sat there feeling a slight tension in my body mixed with anticipation. His voice, calm and reassuring, said he'd step out for a moment to get some oil. I nodded, agreeing, and remained seated in total silence. A minute later, I heard someone come back into the room. It was a steady, unhurried step, but the sound felt slightly different, as if it wasn't Harris. For a brief moment, a thought crossed my mind that something wasn't right, but I quickly dismissed it. It had to be him. It was just my imagination. Warm hands settled on my shoulders and I shivered, feeling a wave of both excitement and embarrassment wash over me. The touch was confident and firm, but slightly rougher than I expected. The fingers kneaded my tense muscles slowly, leaving behind a warm, strangely captivating sensation. Whoever it was, they remained silent, and the quiet only heightened my senses. I allowed myself to relax, feeling the touch gradually ease my tension, yet inside a faint wariness mixed with excitement lingered. From the very first touch, I felt my entire body tense, as if sensing something faintly off, invisible. But as his hands began to glide over my shoulders, that feeling faded, giving way to a familiar calm. Lying there with the blindfold, I let myself relax, convinced that it was Harris, letting myself sink into his touch. His hands, however, felt different from the start, a bit heavier, more insistent. They moved over my skin as though exploring it anew, but I was so lost in my own sensations that I didn't think much of it. As his touch gradually moved lower down my back to my waist, a thrill and a strange sense of anxiety grew within me. But it quickly melted away as his hands slid further down to my hips. His fingers lingered, and in that moment, a sharper, deeper feeling overtook me. Something both familiar and unknown. I could hear my own breathing growing heavier and deeper, my heart pounding harder with every movement. There was something almost forbidden in how his hands continued their slow, lingering path, brushing against my skin, intensifying my senses, pushing me to the edge. His hands moved lower still, gently grasping my hips, and I let out a soft sigh that I couldn't hold back. A shiver swept over me, a wave of desire spreading lower, leaving me no choice but to give in. This warmth grew inside, capturing my mind and leaving me unable to think. I tried to stay composed, but his touch made me forget about reality, consuming all of my senses. He didn't stop. His hands grew bolder, and I felt my whole body respond to the rhythm he set. I could feel his breath, his closeness. And in that moment, all the boundaries that had ever existed between us seemed to blur. The heat in my lower belly intensified, transforming into a throbbing, almost aching desire that responded to his every movement. Then his fingers lingered a moment longer than usual, leaving a trail of warmth on my skin. My body reacted, breath quickening, each inhalation resonating inside me like an electric spark. This moment seemed to stretch on forever. I felt every second, every inch of his touch, as if it could burn right through me. Suddenly, he leaned closer, and I felt his breath on my shoulder, his presence so tangible that I almost forgot to breathe. My heart pounded in my ears, an intense mix of fear and desire roiling within me, and at some point I realized I couldn't remain passive any longer. My hand slowly reached for his shoulder, feeling the warmth and strength beneath my fingertips. In that moment, it was as if everything around us had stopped. I could feel his nearness, his scent, his heavy breath, which made my heart beat even faster. A dizzying sensation washed over me, and I felt as though I could no longer control my feelings. A throbbing, demanding sensation built in my lower belly, capturing me entirely. It was so pleasurable, so overwhelming, that I no longer cared about boundaries. I just allowed myself to go further, following this insane feeling. His hand unexpectedly moved lower, drawing a barely audible moan from me that I couldn't hold back. The heat spreading throughout my body pulsed in sync with his every movement, and I felt my inner tension give way to something stronger, deeper, unstoppable. But then, something shifted. In his movements, in the way he held me, I felt a subtle difference. For a brief moment, my consciousness seemed to break free from the haze of pleasure. This sensation was too unfamiliar, too unexpected, and though I didn't want to shatter this illusion, something inside demanded an answer. Struggling to regain control, I took a deep breath and, without thinking, pulled off the blindfold. I looked up and my heart stopped. In front of me was not Harris. It was Frank. For a moment, I froze, unable to utter a word. My hand trembled, my breathing grew erratic, and I could barely comprehend what had just happened. He stood there, meeting my gaze with eyes that held a confidence that only intensified my panic. I tried to pull away to distance myself, but he looked at me as if he already knew what I would say, what I would feel, and it made me realize he knew exactly what he was doing. At that very moment, the door opened and Harris walked into the room. His face showed complete bewilderment. He didn't even raise his eyes at first. He mumbled something about how he had been delayed on a call, apologized for making me wait, and in horror, I realized I could no longer hide the truth. When Harris looked up, his gaze froze, seeing us together, me with a trembling hand, and Frank, who still stood close with a look of confidence, perhaps even defiance. Harris's expression was like something had broken inside him. I tried to explain, to say something, but the words wouldn't come, and I just stood there, unable to explain what had just happened. Each of us stood trapped in that painful silence, and I realized there would be no going back. Everything that had connected us had shattered in that very moment. The shock hit me like a cold wave. When Frank decided to reveal the truth, he did it with a calmness that felt almost cruel. His words were clear, almost indifferent, as if recounting an old, insignificant story. "You know," he said, looking at me with a cynical smirk, "Harris didn't just know about what happened. He got a nice sum for it." At first, I couldn't grasp the meaning of his words. My head spun, and I couldn't force myself to believe it. But Frank, with a steady tone, continued. "We agreed that if things went smoothly, he'd get his reward. And by the way, he turned out to be a pretty good partner." Each word he spoke cut through me, leaving gaping wounds inside, making it hard to breathe. Frank's voice remained calm, almost carefree, which only made everything he said feel even more brutal. I struggled to comprehend that the person I had trusted had been part of this deception. Harris, with his kindness and understanding, with his tenderness and what had seemed like genuine care, had been a fraud. In the days that followed, I wandered around in a daze. The feeling of betrayal gnawed at me from within. I couldn't understand how I could have been so blind, how I had allowed myself to be deceived so easily. The guilt mingled with the pain and disappointment, leaving deep scars that felt as though they would never heal. I was shattered, lost, and the betrayal made it unbearable even to be around Jake. Now, each time I looked at him, I was overwhelmed by an unbearable sense of deceit, as if my whole life had turned into one big lie. I considered telling him the truth, but something held me back. Perhaps it was the desire to preserve the stability we had built together. But how could I believe in that stability when everything around me felt hollow and contrived? The thought of divorce lingered in my mind, but I was afraid to take the first step. Losing Jake, destroying everything we had built together, felt too daunting. Yet I couldn't go on living in this web of deceit surrounded by memories of betrayal. I was at a crossroads, with each path seeming like a dead end. One evening, when I thought I'd finally have a moment alone, Frank appeared. His face showed neither regret nor remorse. He seemed to savor the moment. Coming up to me, he spoke softly, but with an edge. "You know what will happen if you decide to act on your own terms? I'll tell Jake everything. You wouldn't want to lose him in the last remnants of stability, would you?" His words sent a shiver down my spine. I stood in front of a man who, it seemed, held my entire life in his hands. I could no longer live under the weight of this monstrous lie, even if it meant losing everything Jake and I had shared. Ever since Frank had begun threatening me, I had felt like I was slowly sinking into a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. Before he could deliver the final blow, I decided to take a risk and tell Jake the whole truth. The fear paralyzed me, but it was my last hope to free myself from the darkness threatening to consume me. As I began speaking, Jake listened in silence. At first, there was only a hint of surprise on his face, which quickly turned cold. I laid it all out, about Harris, how this connection, which started as innocent friendship, had morphed into something more, pulling me into a void, and about Frank, his threats, his manipulations, and how he had deliberately destroyed my last refuge of peace. I hoped Jake would understand, that he would see that all these mistakes had stemmed from loneliness and weakness. But judging by the growing hardness in his eyes, there was little hope left. When I finished, Jake looked at me with cold determination. There was no understanding in his eyes, only pain and disappointment. He spoke quietly, clearly, each word cutting deep. "This changes nothing, Maddie," he said, and I felt the ground give way beneath me. You crossed the line. Yes, I'll help you with the legal matters to deal with Frank, but not for you. Because once you were an important part of my life." He paused, and bitterness flickered in his eyes. "But right now, I don't see the woman I knew, the one I trusted." I remained silent, feeling my heart contract in silent desperation. I wanted him to believe in the sincerity of my remorse, but his words shattered all hope. "It's over between us," he stated with cold clarity. "What happened with Harris, this revolting situation with Frank? You destroyed everything, and it's not something I can live with." His voice trembled, and I noticed how he was holding back his anger, his pain, and perhaps a remnant of the tenderness that had once existed between us. In that moment, I understood that neither apologies nor explanations would change anything. He didn't want to hear my remorse. It simply didn't matter to him anymore. Everything good between us was in the past, as if in another realm, unreachable and gone. I was left alone, bearing this weight, knowing there would be no forgiveness or chance for redemption. Once alone, I fully realized the magnitude of my mistakes. Silence filled the house as Jake walked out, leaving me alone with the wreckage I had created. Every corner, every object seemed to reflect memories. Our shared dinners, his laughter, the nights we spent simply talking, wrapped in blankets. I had destroyed all of it, and there was no way to bring it back. Everything good we had was now a ghost of the past. I couldn't escape myself. The guilt haunted me constantly, crushing me under painful thoughts. It felt like everything I once valued was left behind, and ahead lay only uncertainty and a difficult road to atonement. Taking a deep breath, I walked to the window, looking out at the gray sky. I had once believed I could control my life, but now everything seemed different. These mistakes had taught me a harsh lesson, and no matter how painful it was, I knew I had to live with this burden. I knew I couldn't allow Frank to go unpunished for his threats. His manipulation and everything he had put me through shouldn't go without consequences. He had used me, destroyed my last chance at peace, and I couldn't remain silent. Harris, too, had to face the consequences. His role in this monstrous chain of events had delivered the final blow that shattered me. Now that I had nothing left but the truth, I could fight for it, for the chance to restore at least a sliver of justice. The heavy feeling that the past couldn't be undone never left me. But no matter how painful it was, now I had to build something new, even if it meant going forward alone. I was no longer that naive woman who believed in the constancy of relationships and the idea that connections with loved ones would always be strong. The past had changed me forever, but now I could only accept and come to terms with it. I knew that a tough battle awaited me, with the system, with the truth, with myself. And although every step of this journey would be difficult, I felt a faint spark of hope that someday Frank and Harris would pay for what they'd done. I couldn't undo what I had destroyed, but I could at least try to restore justice and perhaps one day find peace.